Welcome to the Working on Wellbeing podcast by the World Wellbeing Movement. The podcast that allows you to be a fly on the wall during conversations with the world's leading wellbeing experts. In today's episode, we'll explore the concept of psychological safety, and we'll find out why it's so critical to drive workplace wellbeing, diversity, inclusion and belonging, learning, effective teamwork, and so much more. And we'll hear tips from the world's leading expert on how to boost psychological safety in the workplace. I'm so honoured to introduce today's guest. Many of you, when I say the term psychological safety, will automatically think of this incredible woman's name. So I couldn't be more thrilled to welcome author of the best-selling book, The Fearless Organization, Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at Harvard Business School, and winner of countless awards, Professor Amy Edmondson. You are so welcome.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm truly delighted to be here.
I mentioned, of course, that when I say the name Professor Amy Edmondson, there's sort of a name association. People will immediately go, psychological safety. And what's incredible is since your work, I believe it was 1999 when you published your first paper, the seminal paper on this topic, the phrase psychological safety is now used in a commonplace way in workplaces. And actually, even in your book in chapter 2, there's a graph and it shows a steep rise in the media mentions of psychological safety, which is incredible. So I do think many of our listeners will already be familiar with the concept, but some may not. And I think it's important to bring everybody listening to that common understanding. So can I ask you, please, to provide a definition for us?
Sure. And, the other reason I think it's important to start that way and start with the definition is that the term has, as you said, become quite familiar, but that doesn't necessarily mean everyone has an accurate definition of the term. And we can talk about that a little more if you wish. But I define psychological safety as a belief that the environment, the climate that you work in is safe for interpersonal risks, like speaking up with an idea, like admitting a mistake or asking for help or pointing out someone else's error. Those are all interpersonally risky or challenging behaviors. Those are the kinds of behaviors that people feel an intuitive risk that they might make people not like them or reject them in some way. And so psychological safety describes an environment where you just believe those risks are absolutely doable. Not that they're easy or fun, but that they're absolutely doable.
Thank you. Before I dive into it a bit more, I'd love to understand how you ended up coming to this domain of research. Was there a sort of pivotal moment in time for you that brought you to study psychological safety?
Yeah, there absolutely was, and it was a mistake, or actually, a mistake is the wrong word. It was a failure. It was a research failure. So my broad interest coming into my PhD program, and making that shift in my career to becoming a researcher, my broad interest was learning organizations, right? How can we better help organizations learn and adapt and innovate in a world that keeps changing? But that's what interested me. I knew enough about organizations from the work, the job I had to know that it's not easy for organizations to change and learn. And so I didn't know exactly how I would study that. But when I was invited in my first year of the PhD program to join a team of medical researchers looking at medication errors and the adverse drug events that sometimes happen as a result, I agreed for two reasons. One, I needed to do something. You need to do research and you need to learn how to do research. And this seemed like a project that was sort of already set up and I could become part of the team and learn a lot. But the other important reason was I'd always seen a connection between error and learning. That's not a unique thought, right? Everybody kind of knows the connection between error and learning. And so I thought it's not entirely unrelated. In fact, it's quite closely related to my core interests. So So that's it. I really wanted to show, I wanted to be able to show with the data available to me in that study that better teamwork was associated with lower error rates or fewer errors. And unfortunately, what the data seemed to suggest once I had it right in front of me and was analyzing it was, yes, there was a significant correlation, but no, it was in the wrong direction. In other words, the data suggested that better teams, according to a validated team survey diagnostic instrument, had higher error rates, right? That doesn't make sense, or at least it didn't seem to make sense to me. And I thought, and it occurred to me, suddenly, sort of a blinding flash, that maybe the better teams were more able and willing to talk about the errors that did happen, right? That they didn't have as much of the natural human desire to not talk about them, or to be afraid that if you talk about them, you'll get punished in some way, which of course is very human and very normal in organizations. So that having that insight was a far cry from proving it, and that's what the next few years were about, was sort of proving the possibility that different groups within the same organizational settings, and I did this in healthcare, and I've done this in manufacturing organizations and other organizations, that different groups, within the same organizational culture can have wildly different interpersonal climates.
Yes.
And turns out that that's demonstrably true, that groups can vary. And it wasn't until several years later that I called this psychological safety. But teams can vary in psychological safety, and that variance is predictive of team learning behaviors and team performance. And that now has been shown in study after study to be the case. So the discovery or the interest in psychological safety was quite by accident. But once seen, yes, it couldn't be unseen, and it became something that seemed worthy of follow-up.
And, for me, this is so important. And I suppose, Amy, in my own background, I'm, currently leading the World Wellbeing Movement and hosting, obviously, our podcast. But I previously have a corporate career, and I've worked in various leadership positions. And creating that environment where we used to talk about fail smart. And what we mean by fail smart is, fail quickly, but take the learnings from those failures so that you can get closer to doing it right the next time. And I think, when I read your work, I think about as children, we're afraid to get in trouble. So if we do something wrong, we'll sweep it under the carpet. And we take those learned behaviors into the workplace. But it's difficult. It's difficult to be honest. Nobody likes to fail. And it's really difficult to say, oh, my bad, I didn't do this right, it went wrong. So it's not an easy thing. I'd love to hear from you a little bit more about the benefits of creating that environment of psychological safety. And you've already talked about some of the challenges in the absence of psychological safety, but if you could elaborate on that, it would be fantastic.
Yeah, I think, in the absence of psychological safety, what happens is, especially if you're a team leader or project manager or a branch leader of some kind, bank branch or something, restaurant in a chain. In the absence of psychological safety, you won't be hearing what's really going on, right? So you won't be hearing the bad news. You'll only be hearing the sort of the good news, the reports of all that's going well. So you're not actually able to do your job as well as you otherwise would, because you don't have all the data. And in the presence of psychological safety, there's now research that shows a variety of desired outcomes, including just team performance, right? And that was famously shown in a study that got a lot of attention at Google called Project Aristotle, studied 180 teams and found that the most effective predictor of team performance, as Google, was psychological safety, again, at the team level. You have some research that shows, in fact, better lower burnout, in at least one, sort of better medical outcomes, again, because people are more able to catch and correct. So you could put all of this under the bucket of learning. There's more learning, there's more sharing of information. And as a result, given how dependent we are on information and knowledge, as a result, you have better performance.
Yeah. And you talk about burnout. Of course, we're seeing increasing rates of burnout. I would love to understand more about the links, what research tells us about the impact of psychological safety on our well-being, on our mental health.
Yeah, so I think that's a relatively new field of inquiry because it's become so very important recently. So I can't cite oodles of studies, but it's certainly consistent with what we know. And there at least are a couple of studies I'm aware of that link psychological safety to lower burnout. And it makes sense, right? Because not having psychological safety is stressful. I mean, it's kind of normal, but it's stressful normal because you're in this state of sort of anxiety about the things you see, and you're trying to think, can I say that? Can I speak up about that? You find various workarounds because you're conscientious, and you feel you can't quite speak up about that thing, but you work around it. And maybe there's a one-on-one meeting later where you can bring something up. All of that takes time and effort and takes its toll on well-being, right? So with psychological safety, I'm not saying psychological safety is descriptive of a sort of easy, comfortable environment. It isn't, but it at least takes you away from that second guessing, which I think is a stressful thing to live through.
I mean, it really, really is. And this concept of an absence of fear, it sounds so much simpler than it is. And we're living in a very unique time. One of the employee fears that you talk about a bit in the book is the basic fear of losing your job. And in today's world, that's a very, very real fear. Over the past year, we've seen numerous announcements of layoffs from some of the biggest companies across the globe at a time when cost of living is rising. I would love to hear your advice to leaders and to employees on, how to nurture psychological safety during this time.
Yeah, I wrote a piece a few years ago soon after the Fearless Organization came out, because I realized sometimes people will have this reaction to like fearless that sounds like reckless or unrealistic for a human to be without fear. And that's right. And so I wrote this little article for Duke Magazine on productive fear versus counterproductive fear or unproductive fear, just to try to be super clear about this. And it is, especially this was sort of in the time of the peak of COVID, it is productive to be afraid of that virus, right? You should be afraid of it. It is productive to be afraid of, sort of losing your job and trying to do a good job as a result. Now, you don't always have control. In fact, more often than not, you don't have very high level of control over who is laid off and who isn't, but we'll come back to that. But, it's productive to be afraid of the competitors, sort of stealing market share from you, right? Because these are all fears. The main reason why they're productive is that they're discussable. Right? There's nothing embarrassing or shameful about going, this is a real worry that we have. You can talk about it and you can team up to mitigate the negative effects of those frightening things on you and your team. Whereas the interpersonal fear, I would argue, is almost never productive, right? Because interpersonal fear leaves you alone. It leaves you sort of unable to talk about it by its very nature. And so you are second guessing yourself. You're wondering whether it's okay to say something or to ask for help or this or that. So it just, and in an uncertain, complex, interdependent world, that leaves you vulnerable to not getting the information you need, not getting support you need, not sharing the important things that you see with colleagues to help them and to help the projects and the work go well. So there's no easy answer to how do we sort of, as W. Edwards Deming said, drive fear out of the organization. But when we work together on it, it really is doable, right? It's powerful, right? If it's so long as we do our very best not to be to remind ourselves that each other are not what we should be afraid of. We should be afraid of these external forces. And in good organizations, now I know they're not all good, but in good organizations, managers go out of their way to be thoughtful. If there are to be layoffs, which is never a happy outcome, to be thoughtful about who and how and under what conditions those layoffs will occur. And the last thing they would do would be lay off the people who are taking interpersonal risks, like speaking up with a concern, or a dissenting view. Those are the people we need,
Yes.
In uncertain times.
I think that's a really important point to highlight, that it's a positive to speak up. It's a positive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And managers need to make sure they are clear about the fact that it's a positive. Right? They need to go out of their way to say these are challenging times and we don't know what will happen. And we need to hear from you more than ever. And those who are quiet are at greater risk than those who are sort of leaning in to try to solve the problems we have.
Yeah, and you give a couple of really good examples in the book of disasters, really, that could have been avoided. The nuclear power plant in Japan, and also the one of the, I think it was the Challenger explosion with NASA. Do you want to talk
Columbia,
more about
actually, but Challenger counts too.
Okay,
it's another story that I do sometimes talk about, but not as much in this book.
Of course, we've seen a very, very radical change to the workplace in the past few years, particularly post-pandemic. So we're now in a situation where a lot of teams are geographically disparate. So I might be working in a London office or a Dublin office, and I'm going to have fellow teammates in Mumbai and Singapore and San Francisco. My manager might be in a completely different time zone. Even if we're in the same location, chances are at least some of your colleagues are working remotely and most are working hybrid. Is it more challenging to create an environment of psychological safety in this sort of dispersed world that we're now living in?
I think the answer is yes, it is. Now, as I say that, I think data are likely being collected as we speak, to be able to talk about this more specifically and precisely. But my qualitative observation, and I think that of many others as well over the last couple of years, is that with greater distance or more virtual relationships at work, psychological safety does take a hit, because you're missing some of the sort of natural and subtle cues that I'm interested in what you have to say. Like, I'll make eye contact with you, or I'll lean in ways that are quite hard to see on the screen. And even more, it's the serendipitous interactions that don't happen, right? I see you in the hallway and I say, oh, there's been something I've been meaning to ask you. But it often does feel quite awkward to kind of send you a message to say, could we set up a Zoom call or Teams call or, WebEx call? And it doesn't feel worthy of that kind of structure and organization. So I sort of let it go. So we're losing some of the spontaneous connectedness that keeps us feeling both connected to each other and more able to just lean in and speak up about things that we wonder about and worry about, or ideas that we might have that might lead toward an innovation downstream. So I think this is something, I'm not saying it's, don't do it. I'm saying let's do it thoughtfully, meaning don't do remote work. Let's do it thoughtfully. Let's do it carefully. Let's figure out, more than anything else, not what people need, which is super important and the core idea of your podcast, but what the work needs, right? What the work needs from us to be done really, really well, and how we're going to organize that and how we're going to do that. And I think that feeds back into well-being, because I think most people, maybe everybody, wants to matter, right? We want to be doing something that matters to the world, whether it's contributing to the production of products and services that make people's lives better, or whether it's, doing healthcare that literally affects health, or writing, entertaining, programming. I mean, that we want to think that what we do matters. It doesn't just land out there with a thud.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And everything you're saying really resonates, and it resonates with what I've seen firsthand in the workplace and the research I'm reading as well. And, when you talk about speaking up is hard enough. And if you're in the room physically, you might be able to pluck up the courage to say, gosh, I disagree. I don't think that's a good idea. But to then have to, as you say, either put it in an email, that's very tough. How do I word it? With email, you're missing all of those body language cues, all of those tone of voice cues, and it's so ripe for misinterpretation. And as you say, scheduling a Zoom call or a Teams call to say, I disagree, is a bit difficult. And certainly all the research we're seeing sort of indicates that for multiple reasons, hybrid working really is the way forward, because, of course, our social connections are key. Flexibility is key, but so are social connections.
Yeah. I think because we were able during the pandemic, when if you had a job that allowed that and was conducive to working from home, we were able to do it. Like, we pulled it off. That doesn't mean that's an ideal way to work, right? Either from a mental health perspective or from a quality of work perspective. It's much like, we were in lifeboats, and we got, we lived through the shipwreck, but it's not to say you want to spend the rest of your life in a lifeboat. It doesn't, it's not optimal.
I hear you. I'd love to read a quick quote from your book, if I may. I'll just find the page, but you talk about psychological safety as being the missing ingredient to achieving diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And of course, it's been proven that inclusion and belonging are key drivers of workplace well-being, and that stands to reason. So the quote, which I thought was really, really interesting, you said, psychological safety may be playing an especially crucial role for minorities in creating engagement and a feeling of being valued at work. Can you talk more about how psychological safety can really help drive diversity, inclusion, and belonging?
Well, first of all, I do want to underline the word may, right? Because this is theoretical, speculative work rather than data-driven findings at this point. Although I think that's another topic for which data are being collected, not by me, but by others. But so let's when we think about sort of the progression from diversity to inclusion to belonging. Where diversity means we have an arguably, objectively more diverse workforce than, say, before, or we can sort of point to people from different identity groups being hired. Yes. That's a kind of obviously a minimum standard, and then to get to inclusion, you really are asking yourselves the question of yes, and are the diverse groups that we have hired equally included in the decision making that matters, in the roles that matter, right? Is there and this is a somewhat subjective and somewhat objective, right? We can point to it. And to, let's say you go from diversity to inclusion, a higher standard of inclusion, that's a little bit dependent on psychological safety, because it's one thing to be around the table. It's another to believe sincerely that your voice is welcome, right? That people like me have a say around here, whether that be women or people of color or people from different countries that are less well represented in your organization, et cetera, right? So it's a lot easier to offer your unique perspective if there's an environment of psychological safety. Now, when we shift even further to the topic of belonging, now we're asking the question of does everyone feel equally like I belong here? People like me are perfectly welcome, have a perfect right to be here in this workforce. And that's an entirely subjective standard, right? It's not so easy to point to the objective criteria by which you'd measure that. And that, I would argue, is even more dependent on psychological safety, because when you don't have the experience of psychological safety, again, permission for candor at work, then that feeling of belonging that others might enjoy just naturally is not yours.
Thank you. And I couldn't agree more, obviously. And when I think about not having psychological safety, for me, that means I don't have the confidence. I don't have the confidence, as you say, to share your view, to share your expertise, to shine maybe in some ways. And how on earth can you get promoted if you can't shine? So it really stands to reason. And hopefully we'll see a lot more research in this area as we move forward. But I want to get to one of my favorite parts of your book, because a lot of the listeners of this podcast are business leaders who really want to improve. Actually, something we tend not to get enough training on is how to be effective people managers. People are diverse. People have different personalities. There's a lot to manage. And I think every manager would agree that they'd love more training. And what I love about this book, in chapter 7, for anybody who's interested, is you lay out a leader's toolkit to explain how leaders can create that environment of psychological safety. Would you be able to give a summary of some of the key tips there, please?
Yeah. So the key tips, I think of it as table setting or stage setting, real time action and responses to things that happen. And in the stage setting, one thing that maybe I don't emphasize enough, but I think when you keep coming back to the purpose of the team, the why it matters, why the work we do matters, even when you think it's utterly obvious, like patient care, right? It turns out that it still matters. It's very powerful and enabling to just remind people that the work we do matters. They matter, right? But more importantly, so that's kind of reminding of purpose and bringing us back, reminding to what really matters. But the part of stage setting that I think is so important is framing the work. And nearly all work today has some degree of uncertainty or complexity or novelty, and just calling attention to that, even, again, though you think it's obvious, right? Gee, we've never done a project like this before. It's an innovation project. Saying it aloud sets the rationale for why it actually makes sense that you want to hear from other people, right? If you are inadvertently implying that you have all the answers, why would you actually even be interested in what anyone else has to say, right? And you may not know that you're inadvertently implying that, but if you don't override it explicitly, like, I might miss something, I need to hear from you. Statements like that are just so powerful. And then the second bit, which is pretty easy to explain, is just ask good questions, right? Invite voice. Like, you might have set the stage beautifully, but there still can be a hesitation for people to just speak up. But, if you ask, as you're doing throughout this time together, you're asking me questions. And even if I felt inclined to kind of hold back, I can't. I have to, it's a human requirement to answer a question. So I answer, right? And you're hearing my voice, and hopefully honest voice, because you've made it clear that you really do value that. And third, how do you respond, when someone disagrees with you or asks for help or brings bad news? And I describe something I call a productive response, which is appreciative and forward-looking. Not fake nice or fake anything, but just genuinely thank you for that clear line of sight, right? That's how can I help? So it's honestly appreciative of the sense the little bits of courage that were involved in your team members speaking up, and then always forward looking, like, where do we go from here? How can I help?
I think it's really important advice, and thank you. And I think anybody who has been in a people manager position, we've all made mistakes. And certainly when I first became a people manager, you think you're supposed to know everything. And you think that somehow you're failing if you go, oh, gosh, I don't know the answer. Does anybody know? But actually, the whole point is the reason you have a team is you've assembled people whose skill set and expertise complements yours. And that's why you want to draw on their expertise and supplement your own.
You're responsible for the questions, not the answers. You're responsible for creating the conditions whereby people can coordinate to do great work, not, controlling and commanding and having all the knowledge that's needed. As you say, if you've done a good job selecting a team or been given a good team, their expertise is really relevant, and that's why you're there. You're the process architect, not the provider of answers.
Now, you talked earlier about diversity, inclusion, and particularly belonging being subjective and difficult to measure. But it strikes me that psychological safety is quite difficult to measure. And in some ways, how do you measure silence? How do you even notice silence? How do you identify the people who aren't speaking up? Is there a way, if business leaders read Chapter 7 and start implementing your advice, how do they track progress? How do they see improvement?
Well, I guess there's a formal and an informal answer to that. And the formal answer is there is a measure, and it's publicly available, a 7-item survey that I developed for that 1999 paper. That's quite a robust measure. And you can find it at fearlessorganization.org, I think, or maybe it's .com, I'm not sure. But it's a free measure that, you can use with your team. And, you can track it. And I tend to think of it as a useful tool, not for getting the answer, but for provoking discussion. But in the absence of that more formal measure, there is the self-discipline of asking yourself, what is the ratio of the sort of good news to bad that I'm hearing, or the successes to failures, or the all's well versus requests for help? And, if you're a little too, if what you're hearing is a little too rosy and you're working in an uncertain, complex, novel environment, the chances are there are things you're not hearing. Right? So just that sort of self-discipline to just reflect on the ratio. And I'm not saying there's a right answer for what the ratio should be, but that train yourself to listen for the dog that didn't bark, as the famous Sherlock Holmes story puts it, right? It's because as you say, it's so much harder to notice things that aren't happening.
Yes.
But remind yourself of the things that ought to be happening.
Yeah, I love
the
that.
bumps in the road.
The dog that didn't bark. I love that. I'll have to look up that Sherlock Holmes reference. So when it comes to workplace well-being and indeed to creating an environment of psychological safety, there's so many factors that are such a part of the workplace that they can either boost psychological safety or destroy it. And one of those, I think, is the performance review process. Now, this is a bit of a loaded question because it is a personal bugbear of mine. But I would love to know what changes you would like to see within that performance review process to really boost psychological safety.
There is an implicit idea baked into most performance review processes that the job of the manager is to evaluate the performance of the employee, and that they are able to do that, right? That they have omniscience or full knowledge about whether or not and to what degree the employee's performance was up to expectations. It's a faulty assumption, right? Because they don't have omniscience. They have a partial view of what happened. They have their perspective on what happened, but the employee also has a valid and important and valuable perspective on what happened. So I am a huge fan of a book on this topic that I just recommend so highly, called Get Rid of the Performance Review by UCLA professor Sam Colbert. It's the title is more strident than he really means. What he says is you got to get rid of the broken assumptions embedded in the performance review that creates these very faulty dynamics and basically makes the whole activity quite ineffective at doing what it's supposed to do, which is to, enable good performance. And he says you've got to replace the performance review with, and he uses this wonderful term, a performance preview, where both metaphorically and in some cases literally, we sit on the same side of the table looking forward, right? The manager and the subordinate look forward at what has to happen this year. Now, we can use data and experience from last year to inform this conversation. In fact, I think we should do that. But there is a clear understanding of a mutual responsibility that we both own for ensuring great work next year. So I have, let's say I'm your manager, I have some ideas about what I need from you, but I also need you to tell me what you need from me to be able to deliver on this very challenging assignment, right? And by the way, if things don't go well, it's at least as much my responsibility as yours because I'm the manager, right? They pay me more than they pay you. It's my job to help you be effective. So what's really wrong with the performance review process in most organizations is that it's based on a sort of a set of faulty assumptions that inevitably lead to bad outcomes that are not intended by anyone.
Yeah, and how you describe that really does take the fear out of it, actually, which is so important. Just really having that manager support, knowing that your manager has your back. That's exactly the type of conversation which will help me, to be honest, and which will help me to say, well, do you know what? I'm struggling with this. Have you any advice? Which is fantastic. One of the things I'd also love to see with the performance review process is it bugs me when I see maybe a brilliant salesperson get promoted because they've overachieved all their targets. But in doing so, they've been belittling their colleagues and they've been making the types of comments which will absolutely destroy psychological safety. Because if I'm struggling with my confidence and if one of my colleagues is belittling me, taking credit for my work, I'm going to shrink a little bit more. So in a previous company I worked for, they had the CEO coined the term decency quotient. So which I love. Decency quotient is all about how we treat others. Do we treat others with respect? And it can also be about, do we do well by doing good? Do we, use our volunteer days? There's so much to this concept of decency quotient, but what I loved was in that performance review process, that came into the conversation. So it wasn't just, did Bob hit all his sales targets, but rather in doing so, did Bob display decency? I feel like there's changes like this that could be made that will also help, psychological safety thrive.
I mean, good performance in well-run organizations is that combination of decency and sort of, whatever objective metrics of output. But in order for this, better, learning-oriented, more effective style of management to take hold, a manager has to truly want to help the subordinate. You have to want to help the subordinate more than you want to judge and feel superior to. And that's often an internal shift that you can't assume is present. Right? So to be a people manager, you have to be in that role because you want to help others do well. And it's not about you, right? It's about them. But if your primary goal is to lord your power over others or to judge others, you probably won't do as good a job in that role.
Yeah, so true. Amy, I'd love to go into what I like to call the rapid fire round.
Great.
So what do you do to work on your well-being on a daily basis, daily or weekly basis?
Well, I think the easiest answer, and it's a true answer, is I really do try to get enough sleep. Some people in my environment boast about how little sleep they get. I mean, I'm the opposite. I really need sleep. I think it's without it, I don't think as clearly. I don't feel as good. So sleep matters to me, and exercise does as well. And I'm not saying I'm out there running marathons. I'm not, but I do like to run, and I do like the feeling of, just getting out there and working a little harder at something physical.
And of course, all the science tells us to get out in nature, but then we get so overwhelmed with workloads that we leave that good advice at the door. So it's so important to remember that. And I also want to pick up on the busyness status that you brought up. We need to overcome this.
Yes.
Boasting about I'm busier than you are is not going to help society in any way. So,
No.
Isn't it great to start boasting about, I got a full 8-9 hours sleep last night,
Right.
Yeah.
And people, it's the new, oh, how are you? I mean, you know exactly what the answer is going to be: busy.
Yes.
And I'm guilty as charged. And busyness, I think busyness isn't something to be proud of, even though, again, I do live in a glass house here, but it's often that you're not prioritizing well enough, right? Not picking and choosing the things where either you can really add value or you really get joy or meaning, and doing your very best to say no, which is an act of kindness, really, to yourself and others. Because if you say yes and then you do them with resentment, that's no good. So it's trying to think about the best use of your time.
The power of saying no. We had Dr. Kelly Harding on a previous episode, and Kelly and I bonded over the fact that we realized we were both people pleasers, and we're both trying to become reformed people pleasers. So we're setting up informally PPA, People Pleasers Anonymous, to remind all of us to start saying no. Not an official thing, I should say, but we should all start
careful. It may
no.
become official very soon.
It may. We need badges and everything. The next question I had for you, you had a really interesting graph showing, again, I mentioned at the beginning, the increase in the media mentions of psychological safety over a period of 25 years. Now, if you could hop into a time machine and you could travel 25 years in the future, what is the change that you would like to see?
Wow. That's a good question. Well, first of all, I mean, you're right. I do publish that graph, and that's before the book even came out. So and I haven't done that analysis recently, but the chances are it's gone way up. Yeah. Although I think 25 years in the future, I'd like to see it go way down, because it becomes just a given. It's like talking about, breathing. You don't need to talk about breathing very often, because you have to breathe, right? So if it became sort of commonplace that everybody understood that work environments need to feel like you have permission for candor, then we wouldn't see lots and lots of articles about it, because you wouldn't need to.
What a brilliant answer. And on that note, Amy, I just want to say a huge thank you. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I've learned so much, and I think you've given such brilliant advice to all of our listeners.
Well, you're very kind. Thank you for having me.